Good afternoon. My name is Martin Sklat from University College Roosevelt, and I'll have a pleasure to host today's ORPHEUS project webinar on the subject of online alternatives for combating violent extremism. I would like to warmly welcome our speakers, our project partners, and all the members of the audience. So we have a full agenda today. After a short introduction provided by our project leader and the house rules, we will introduce our presenters. Then we'll have two presentations, 40 minutes each. And after the presentations, we'll have time for discussion and questions and answers. And at the very end, we'll have some closing words again from our lead partner. So there are a couple of things that it's good to know in relation to this webinar. It is recorded. Probably you got a notification about it. So it will be recording will be available later on the project site. I think by default everybody has their microphone muted, but if by accident they turn on, please mute it. We also opted for switching off the cameras to preserve the bandwidth to make sure that that the main content is transferred well, so you can hear very well what's going on and see everything good. And there will be some of you might not have access to the chat, so if you have questions for the presenters, please use this small raise hand option to raise your hands, and this way we will know that you want to ask questions to the presenter, and then we will unmute you during the discussion session and ask you to form your to express your questions and participate in this discussion. If you have access to the chat, you can also type in part of your question in the chat, but definitely raise your hand for that. So this is the plan. So I will give now the floor to our lead partner and our project manager, Hilde Lauwers from Municipality of Mechelen. She will introduce us to the project.
Okay, thank you, Martin. And also for me, thank you all for joining us on a Friday afternoon. So my name is Hilde Lauwers. I'm project manager of the ORPHEUS project, and I'll just give a short introduction on ORPHEUS, what it's all about. So ORPHEUS stands for Offline and Online Radicalization, Prevention, Holding Back Extremism, and Upholding Security. The key word here is prevention, so we are not focusing on de-radicalization or mitigation, rehabilitation, things like that. It's really a prevention project, and it's focused also on young people. There are different partners from different countries, and the project will last until the beginning of 2023. I still see there's a small mistake here. But beginning of 23, all our conclusions will be available. Okay, thank you. Maybe also to mention is that our project is funded by the Interreg 2Cs de Mer 2 Zeeën. Okay, next slide, please. So these are the ORPHEUS partners. We are two local governments, City of Mechelen in Belgium and Portsmouth City Council in the United Kingdom. And then there are two educational social services from France and the Netherlands. That's Greta Grand Littoral and Contour de Twern. And then we have, I could say, knowledge and expertise centers. There's CPIRE from Belgium with an expertise in radicalization, University of Portsmouth with online cybercrime, online cybercrime, Achtervelde University with a focus on social work and radicalization, and University College Roosevelt with an expertise, I think, in qualitative research and in evaluation. Okay, next slide, please. So ORPHEUS, like I just said, is focused on prevention and on young people. And what we will provide are three main objectives. And these are providing safe spaces for vulnerable young people to express their grievances. Safe spaces in the sense that we implement and evaluate the concept of safe spaces. How does it work? These can be online or offline environments in the broader sense, where young people can express their opinions, their grievances, and we will support them also to express them publicly. We will also support professionals, so social workers and other professionals, to help set up these kind of safe spaces. We focus also on online safety for young people, and for this we develop tools for young people, trainings on online awareness, but also all the narratives that we will post online to protect them really from grooming and to have different kind of narratives in their context, in their world. And last thing is guidance and policy recommendations for the adoption of our prevention methods. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So although we have 3 main objectives, there are also a lot of challenges. You can imagine working on a topic like extreme violent extremism, polarization, radicalization. It's not an easy topic, and there are a lot of different opinions and views on this. So in the beginning of the project, we identified 7 main challenges. The first one is, do we focus on a central safety threat? Up until recently, you could say, the main focus was on jihadism and all the challenges that gives us on prevention work. But this is surely not enough. Just think about extreme right or other movements, you could say, like incel. So there are different kinds of safety threats. The next thing is the explanation model. This means is radicalization, or is the road to violent extremism lineal? Does it go from one step to another, or are there different factors that we can identify that have an influence? The role of ideology, again, is it how important is ideology? What kind of prevention do we envision? Very direct intervention or more global intervention? Prevention. What about online prevention? Of course, the world of young people is for a main part in the online world. And how do we, how can we be present and in this online world of young people? 6th challenge is the role of frontline workers, youth workers. How do they? What is their position between security policies and having a trust relationship with young people? And this is can be a challenge. And where do we support them? And last but not least, the position of young people. Are they just objects of prevention, or are they also subjects of prevention? Do they have a real voice in developing prevention interventions, prevention methods? Okay, so thank you. Next slide. So today we're going to focus mainly on online prevention. So it's about developing alter narratives, but I surely think the other challenges will be raised and addressed also in this webinar. Next slide, please. So I give the floor back to Marcin. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Hilde. So now we know about the Orpheus project in general and about the position of this particular workshop in it. So this webinar is part of our contribution to the project. So in particular to the goal of developing means for online and offline prevention of violence with young people and their education as central actors. So yes, what here we are really trying to support young people to work as a prevention agents as well. Besides this webinar, we are also developing the guide, which will be available on the project side, which is to a large degree in very close relationship to this webinar. The guide is aiming to help educators and young people to create and promote media expressing their social concern in such a way that they protect you from online grooming to violent extremism. So this guide is based on a thorough review of empirical research and relevant theories, and in order to provide scientifically supported advice. The target audience for this guide, which is not a surprise, and webinar, are the members of organizations engaged in supporting youth, content creators, and content creators themselves, all those who are interested in providing and sharing narratives preventing violent extremism in any form, as well as students and scholars of psychology and communication studies interested in terrorism studies. So, oops, sorry. Okay. So today we have two guests. Something wrong went with my slides. Two guests. First speaker is Johanna Taake, who did the research at UCR, identifying and analyzing YouTube videos, which supposedly have a preventing value against violent extremism. And these videos will also serve as examples in the alter narrative guide. And then we'll have our esteemed invited speaker, Dr. Kurt Braddock from School of Communication of American University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Braddock published his work in key communication and security journals, for instance, Communication Monographs, Terrorism and Political Violence, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. He also advised UK Home Office, Public Safety Office in Canada, the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, US Department of Homeland Security, and Department of Defense, among others. His research focused on persuasive strategies used by violent extremist groups to recruit and radicalize their audiences. And even more importantly for our webinar today, on how the theories of communication, persuasion, and social influence can be used to inform practices meant to prevent radicalization among vulnerable audiences. In his recent book titled Weaponized Words, the Strategic Role of Persuasion in Violent Radicalization and Counter-Radicalization, he provided examples of how terrorist groups persuade audiences to adopt their intelligence and how this process can be fought. So without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Johanna Taake.
All right, thank you. I'll be giving the first presentation, so I'm going to share my screen now. Let me see. Where is it? You cannot see it now, can you? Here we go.
It's visible now.
Yeah, are you able to see it?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, it works now.
Okay, great. Then welcome everyone to the first presentation. I'm Johanna Taake, and I've been researching the topic of preventing violent extremism through an alternative narrative approach together with Dr. Schlatt and Dr. Pargate, University College Roosevelt in the Netherlands. To support the ORPHEUS project, we've created a guide on the topic of alternative narratives for violent extremism prevention. And Dr. Schlatt has already a little bit explained what the guide is going to be about. I just want to add that the guide really also aims at translating the theory into practice, and we also use like video examples to illustrate how the theory can be implemented in praxis. The structure of this presentation is going to follow the structure of the guide. However, the guide is a lot more detailed and in depth. So once it's been released, you might want to consult it if you want to know more about certain aspects. So I will start the presentation by introducing the topic and giving some theoretical background, clarifying some concepts such as what are narratives, what are violent extremist narratives specifically, and what counter and alternative narratives are. In the main part of the presentation, we're going to look at alternative narratives, specifically at relevant features, possible content, and possible ways to structure alternative narratives. In the end, there'll be a short conclusion and recap. So in this photos, you can see the victims of the terrorist attack in Norway from 2011, where Braddock shot 77 people in Oslo and on the island Utøya. Before committing the mass murder, he uploaded a manifesto called the European Declaration of Independence to the internet. And in this manifesto, it became clear that he was inspired by anti-Islamic rhetoric and narratives. The anti-Islamic narrative promotes violence against Muslims, so it becomes clear that the violent extremist narratives promoted the radicalization process of Braddock. Researchers believe that violent extremism is on the rise, and we know that the existence of violent extremist ideologies and narratives promotes those trends. So it's very important to find ways of preventing individuals from adopting violent extremist narratives. And in this presentation, we're going to see some possible ways of how we might potentially be able to inoculate individuals against adopting violent extremist narratives. However, I first want to clarify some concepts for you. So for the purpose of our research, we use the definition of narrative by Dr. Braddock and Taake, who define a narrative as any cohesive and coherent account of events with an identifiable beginning, middle, and end. A narrative must include characters that drive the plot to create questions and conflicts through their actions, and also answers and resolutions for those conflicts must be provided. So that's the general definition of narratives. Now let's look at violent extremist narratives. And in our research, we defined violent extremism as the hoarding of exclusive thoughts that don't allow for the possibility of differences and aim at creating a conformist society. Extremists aim at imposing their worldview on others by violent means. In general, violent extremist narratives follow a specific structure that usually starts by presenting a political or societal grievance, and then they present violence as the driving force for change to overcome those grievances and to arrive at an utopic state that's the end point of the violent extremist narrative. I just want to highlight that it's very important that violent extremism is not defined by a specific ideology or by the degree that an ideology differs from the mainstream. It's very much defined by whether and how it justifies violence. So now we're going to look at alternative and counter narratives. And they've received support by the literature for being an early and universal prevention method for violent extremism. Both of them can be described as narratives with the purpose of combating violent extremist narratives and eliciting illegal and non-violent activities instead of violence. However, alternative and counter narratives are very distinct in some points. Counter narratives directly address violent extremist narratives by falsifying certain aspects or presenting incongruities of the violent extremist narratives. So they are reactive type of messaging, which poses some limitations, which show that they, for example, risk to draw more attention to the violent extremist narratives. And they've also been shown to work best to inoculate people that are not yet engaged in the violent extremist narratives, however, are likely to be rejected by people that are already engaged or affiliated with it. So because of those challenges that counter narratives pose, we decided to focus on alternative narratives in our research. Alternative narratives do not directly focus on addressing violent extremist narratives, but they rather aim at replacing certain elements that make violent extremist narratives attractive. So they're rather positively framed, which means that they highlight what are we for rather than what are we against. So for instance, an example of an alternative narrative might promote a faith-based form of citizen involvement or civic engagement among young people, which then works to inoculate this group against violent extremist narratives. So now we're going to move into the main part of the presentation and look at some features of alternative narratives that are relevant to making them effective in replacing violent extremist narratives. So we're going to answer the question, how can we identify or develop alternative narratives to prevent individuals from getting involved in violent extremist narratives? And for this purpose, we have to determine or define some features of the alternative narratives, starting by the target audience. Knowing who your target audience is and having an in-depth understanding of that is very important, because the qualities of the target audience determine all the other features of the alternative narrative. The next point to consider is the content. However, I'm not going to be going into detail about this now because the next part of the presentation focuses on the content. Related to the content is the modality, which refers to the way in which the content is expressed and might, for example, include considerations of the degree of emotionality of the content. Similarly important to the content is the messenger or the source of delivery, and whether a messenger is likable, trustworthy, authentic. It determines not only whether the messenger is accepted, but pretty much determines if the whole narrative or the whole message is accepted or rejected by the target audience. The last point to consider is the delivery or dissemination method. An alternative narrative should be delivered to the networks where the target group is active. So in our case, we focused on videos on social media, specifically on YouTube. Now we're going to dive deeper into the content aspect of the alternative narratives. So to identify possible contents of alternative narratives, we searched YouTube according to themes that we identified from the literature, and we used the following keywords to identify and find those videos. These keywords were stories about peace, non-violent stories, or alternatives to violence. And for the search process, we were able to identify 10 popular videos on YouTube that we then continued to analyze. And for this process, we were able to identify 4 main content categories that we believe to be potentially effective in having a preventive value against violent extremist narratives. So the first category is the promotion of a nuanced, factual and reasonable view on issues. The second one being the empowerment of the audience. The third one is the demonstration of legitimate and effective alternatives to violence. And the last one is the promotion of common non-divisive identities. Now we'll be going into detail about all of those content categories respectively. And I'm also going to be showing you some examples of the videos that we analyzed. However, this will only be some short sequences because of the time constraints. But if you would like to watch the whole videos and some more videos, you could consult the guide later. So to inoculate people against violent extremist narratives, alternative narratives can promote a nuanced, factual and reasonable view on issues. And this can be achieved in several ways. So first of all, alternative narratives might aim at eliminating black and white thinking. Black and white thinking is the tendency of people to see things in extremes and not consider the in-betweens. So people might label other people as either good or bad according to arbitrary characteristics. And this way of thinking can reduce psychological barriers to violence, rendering people more likely to use violence against people of another group or people that they perceive as the out group. So that makes it very important for alternative narratives to address those black and white thinking patterns and to maybe point out grey areas. Alternative narratives can achieve this by highlighting themes of diversity and showing that attitudes, identities, and behaviours of our group members can be diverse, changeable, unconventional, and unpredictable. So by showing those qualities that might help to eliminate those rigid kind of thinking patterns. Other ways of eliminating black and white thinking might be to show the complexity of specific issues. So we're showing different nuances and how complex an issue actually is. It makes it harder for people to apply their predefined categories to judging a specific issue or situation. Another strategy for promoting a nuanced view is the promotion of critical thinking. And critical thinking can be promoted by using alternative narratives to point out incongruencies or flaws of binary thinking patterns, of those black and white thinking patterns, by, for example, showing that this way of thinking clashes with real-world experiences. I'd like to show you a sequence of one of the two examples now. The protagonist of this narrative is the son of a man who was part of a terrorist attack as part of the IS.
I found out that one of the kids I had befriended was Jewish. Now, it had taken several days for this detail to come to light, and I realized that there was no natural animosity between the two of us. I had never had a Jewish friend before, and frankly, I felt a sense of pride in having been able to overcome a barrier that for most of my life I had been led to believe was insurmountable. Another major turning point came when I found a summer job at Busch Gardens, an amusement park. There I was exposed to people from all sorts of faiths and cultures, and that experience proved to be fundamental to the development of my character. Most of my life I'd been taught that homosexuality was a sin, and by extension that all gay people were a negative influence. As chance would have it, I had the opportunity to work with some of the gay performers at a show there, and soon found that many were the kindest, least judgmental people I had ever met.
So what we could see in this video is that the protagonist had positive interactions with people from the gay and Jewish community, which helped him to change his mind, change his attitudes. So the next point for promoting a nuanced and factual and reason review on issues is to promote critical information consumption and media literacy. And this can be achieved by alternative narratives, by drawing awareness to the issue of media manipulation and highlighting the importance of media literacy. Alternative narratives can also introduce techniques that the audience can use to become a more critical information consumer. The next big content category is the individual empowerment, and that refers that alternative narratives can try to empower the audience to increase their beliefs in their abilities to overcome challenges in non-violent ways. So alternative narratives can aim at empowering the audience by showing the personal growth of the protagonist and their ability to overcome challenges and hardships through strength, work, and commitment to non-violent means instead of turning violent or accepting victimhood positions. Seeing the protagonist succeed might increase the audience's beliefs in their own ability to overcome challenges. Another way of empowering the audience is to validate the experience of grievances before presenting solutions. It's important to consider both aspects because only presenting grievances could actually promote the radicalization process, so also solutions for those grievances have to be offered. The grievances that can be presented in the alternative narratives could be personal or others' grievances. Personal grievances refer to hardships that are experienced by the protagonists themselves, while others' grievances refer to the problems and hardships of another group that the protagonist witnesses and then might adopt because he emphasizes with them and experiences the wish to help them. So I now want to show you an example video. So let's see. Okay, now we see a protagonist who's immigrated to the US where he got shot by a white supremacist.
To this from personal experience.
Okay.
I was one of these innocent victims. I became a survivor. Not satisfied though, I eventually began to thrive, utilizing the tools that this great country provides and choosing the path of mercy, compassion, and forgiveness, which ultimately brought me here today. After graduating as a pilot officer from Bangladesh Air Force Academy, I did not feel my destiny was there. When I got a chance to come to the United States for additional higher education, I took it. I left my family, my home, my fiance, my career to come to the United States to fulfill my educational pursuits, but also hoping to experience the American dream. But within a short time, my American dream turned into an American nightmare. Shortly after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, a white supremacist in Dallas was in a shooting rampage, killing Muslims. I was one of his victims.
Okay, thank you. I think you can stay on this. I'm just going to continue because the next video is going to come soon. So by acknowledging and validating the experience of various grievances and alternative narratives, they might legitimize the experience of grievances for the target audience and can contribute to an open conversation about them. Having an open conversation about grievances and communicating acceptance might eliminate the need for some individuals to turn towards violence, extremist narratives for justification, validation, and support of their hardships. After acknowledgement of the grievances, the alternative narratives might feature some non-violent, law-confirmed strategies that the protagonist is shown to use to overcome the hardships. And those could be the focus on positives of the experiences regardless of the hardships, or the reframing of grievances into opportunities for growth. And we're going to watch a second sequence of the same narrative now to see how this protagonist deals with this grievance.
I wanted this world to be more merciful, forgiving. I had suffered a lot, lost a tremendous amount because of someone else's hatred. But the tragedy helped me to see the possibility of a world without hate, a world full of love, compassion, and empathy. I could not save the life of Mark Stroman.
So this clearly showed that even though the protagonist was a victim of a violent racist attack, he used his experience to work towards a more empathetic, forgiving, and merciful world. So other strategies that might be shown to be used by the protagonist to overcome their hardships could be the seeking of answers and education to get ahead of their issue and to understand it better, to empower themselves. But it could also be the reliance on religious faith or the building of different sorts of interpersonal resources, which could be reliance on external support or receiving a formal training. Alternative narratives should also legitimize the use of those nonviolent strategies for overcoming the grievances, which can be achieved by, for example, showing that they are effective in bringing the protagonist closer to their goal of resolving the grievances, and by showing that the protagonist benefits from being nonviolent. So that could be shown to gain a sense of power or pride or receive public recognition and respect for overcoming their grievances in nonviolent ways. Do you switch to the next slide? Thank you. The next big content category is the demonstration of alternative strategies to violence. And this is very much related to the last point because it also talks about strategies that are shown to be used by the protagonist. However, what I want to highlight here is that the strategy should not only be effective in addressing the personal grievance of the protagonist, it should also be effective in exerting democratic influence. So being effective in achieving change on a larger scale and on a higher political and societal level. The next step in promoting legitimate and effective alternatives to violence is to increase the audience's confidence in their ability to exert political control and achieve change themselves. So the audience should feel like their individual actions can impact political processes and that engaging in civic duties is worthwhile. So alternative narratives might achieve this by facilitating the perception of effectiveness and of legitimacy of those nonviolent strategies for exerting democratic influence. A good example of a narrative that aims at increasing the audience's confidence in their abilities to achieve change is the narrative of Salvato. And he was born in Argentina in a poor neighborhood where he grew up with disabled people, witnessing their problems. And in school, he learned programming and about computers, and he used this knowledge to develop an app and ultimately grow the company to facilitate the communication of disabled people. So now we could watch that.
but our generation, you, me, and lots of young people listening to this, we are the breaking point between past and future, right? We are the generation that has to grab all the knowledge of the past and put it to good use to allow and embrace a cool future, right? Driven by technology, but not only a technological future, like in the most literal way, but also a more inclusive, more fair, more equal future, right? And we can do it. We can do it through technology. Like if I could do it, and I'm just an average 21-year-old with like the same issues and I don't know, fears and stuff of every 21-year-old around the world, or maybe most of us. Everyone can do it. Everyone can embrace technology and empower themselves and their communities.
I very much like this narrative because we see a young person, an average person, being very successful in achieving large-scale change, which then motivate and can inspire the audience that they are able to achieve similar things. Now we've seen that so far alternative narratives largely focus on presenting alternative strategies to violence. However, they might also show that violence is a negative strategy for achieving change and exerting democratic influence. And this can be achieved by, for example, showing that violence is ineffective according to political or historical examples that prove this point, or they could take the victim's perspective and highlight the harmfulness of violence that the victims have to deal with. Alternative narratives can also take the perpetrator's perspective, and for this angle, they could show the negative consequences that engagement in violence has for the person engaging in it. By showing the negative sides of engagement in violence, alternative narratives might discourage people from engaging in those sort of strategies. Okay, the next slide. The last big content category is the promotion of common non-divisive identities. Violent extremist narratives use identitarian division and categorization, which kind of promotes an us versus them group division and sort of thinking. Alternative narratives can recategorize individuals into common groups and replace this identitarian division by, for example, promoting the perception of a common humanity. And a common humanity perception can be promoted by utilizing themes of forgiveness, empathy, mutual respect, acceptance, etc. And for using those themes, the perception of connection over separation and common humanity over group-based thinking is created. Another strategy for promoting common divisive identities is to dissolve group-based thinking by humanizing the subject of the extremist narrative. It can be achieved by focusing on the vulnerable aspects of this population and highlighting the victim's position to increase perception of empathy with those outgroups. The next step that alternative narratives could take is to highlight the similarities and commonalities between groups by, for example, presenting common goals or even common threats that people have to work together to overcome. Lastly, alternative narratives might show the collaboration between opposing groups. And now we watch another sequence of a video of the same person we already watched 2 sequences of. And all those 4 strategies for promoting non-divisive common identities are implemented in this sequence.
But what are we prepared to do to get it? I believe it starts within each of us, taking a moment to check where your moral compass lies. Take a moment to soften your heart, make your tone a little bit friendlier. Take time to connect with others unlike you. Stand up against all manifestations of hate. Take a moment to forgive someone who hurt you in the past. Extend a helping hand, reaching out to your family, friends, neighbors who may be going through some challenges instead of ignoring them. Because by doing so, you could positively affect and even save innocent lives. Together, we must stand up against human suffering if we think we may not like the victims. The challenges Muslims, Jews, Mexicans, African Americans, women, the LGBTQ community, and all who are suffering right now may not affect your or your loved one's life today, but may indeed tomorrow. I would like.
Great, now you can move to the next slide. That was it about the possible contents aspect of the alternative narratives, and now we're going to look at the possible structure of alternative narrative videos. So when analyzing the videos, we noticed that they follow a similar structure, which was the structure of the classical narrative arc. This arc describes how the tension builds up during the course of a narrative, and it's divided into 5 stages: the exposition, the raising action, the climax, following action, and resolution elements. Next slide. And this structure is implemented in the alternative videos in the following ways. So in the exposition phase, the messenger, the characters, the setting, and conflicts are introduced. The action is raising when the protagonist's initial emotional reaction to the grievance was presented. And those initial reactions were either low, confirm, and peaceful, or angry and violent. When the initial reaction was angry or violent, the narrative first continues to describe how the protagonist learned to reject violence as a strategy before adopting peaceful strategies. The climax of the narrative was reached when the protagonist or the characters discovered or committed to those non-violent strategies. The narratives then continue to describe the process in which the protagonist learned to deal with their grievances peacefully, and eventually the resolution of the conflict was provided. In the resolution phase, the learnings that the protagonist had over the course of the narratives were summarized and made explicit in like an alternative message. And also the activism work and the achievements of the protagonist were highlighted at the end of the narratives. So I want to illustrate how that can look at the example of one possible alternative narrative. We've seen the 3 sequences of this narrative already. The protagonist of this story immigrated to the USA to follow the American dream, but soon he got shot by a white supremacist. This is the introduction to the situation and presents the conflict, so that's the exposition phase. The protagonist then survives and wakes up in a hospital. Following this, he experienced a variety of struggles that resulted from being shot, which was the loss of sight. He lost his job, he was feeling insecure and struggled financially. This is the rising action element. And the narrative slowly moves towards the climax when it starts to describe the protagonist started a campaign to help save the life of his attacker who was sentenced to death because of the crime that he committed. The climax is finally reached when the racist attacker changes his mind about violence and his racist motives and starts to cooperate with the protagonist on promoting peace. So we see that the climax is when both important characters of the story commit towards non-violence. In the following action element, the outcome of the situation becomes apparent. The attacker could not be saved from the death row, regardless of the positive efforts of the protagonist. However, the learnings from the story and the positive message remains. So in the resolution phase, the message of forgiveness, connection, empathy, and kindness is summarized and linked to the everyday experiences of the audience to make it more approachable. Lastly, the narrative shows that the life of the protagonist has changed over the course of the narrative, and now he's focused on being an activist for peace and working for his non-profit organization against hate. So what we can learn from this example is that this way of introducing tension and structuring a narrative can contribute to making a narrative more appealing, and in this way potentially making it more effective. However, the classical narrative arc is only one possible way of to structure a narrative. In other ways, other structures might be just as appealing and as effective. Next slide. Now we are already at the conclusion, and we've seen in this presentation that identifying and developing alternative narratives to violent extremist narratives requires determining important features, possible content, and the possible structure of alternative narratives. These information can be used by anyone who wants to identify, evaluate, or create alternative narratives for violent extremism prevention. Because the information was held very general, it can be adjusted to the needs and preferences of pretty much any target group. Once you know who your target group is supposed to be. So yeah, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I apologize for not being able to show the videos at first.
Thank you very much, Johanna, for your very inspiring presentation. I'm sure this will be very helpful to anybody who would like to create alternatives and alternative videos, especially and distribute them on the internet. You did fantastically fitting within the time, despite all these challenges of technical issues that we had to overcome. Thanks a lot. And then indeed at the very end of the whole, after presentation of our invited guests, we'll have the question and answer sessions. So now, without any further ado, I would like to invite our guest speaker, Dr. Kurt Braddock.
And I'm here. I'm just going to test my mic real quick. Can you hear me okay, Dr. Sklad?
Yes, I can hear you very well. I cannot see you at the moment. Oh, now I can see you as well.
There we go. And now the last bit that we need to do here is, if I could find my slides. There we go. How are we going? Did technology fail us, or is technology successful today?
Successful.
Technology
Excellent.
is successful.
All right.
Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Very, very happy to be here. And I'm glad that I jumped in on a few minutes early, too, because I'd kind of been going back and forth when Professor Sklad asked me to speak. The question was basically, okay, you can talk about something related to communication and extremism. And I've done a bit of work in a bunch of different spaces related to communication and extremism, including counter and alternative narratives. So that was an option. I popped on right to see Johanna's talking, and I saw she was discussing alternative narratives. So I did a little bit of an internal celebration, because I decided to go with a different topic regarding counter messaging and violent extremism. And a different kind of strategy that's being employed at a greater rate than it had been in the past. So what I'm going to talk about today is something called attitudinal inoculation. And this is a strain of research that I began a couple of years ago. I'm still doing some work on counter and alternative narratives, but inoculation is where I dedicate most of my energies these days. But first, before I get started, let me introduce myself so you know who the person sitting in front of you talking is. I am Dr. Kurt Braddock from American University in Washington, D.C. At American, I am in the School of Communication, where I study basically social influence, persuasion in the context of violent extremism. In the U.S., I focus pretty heavily on the growth and the proliferation of the far right. And the work that I do, I often do quite a bit of consultancy to the U.S. government, the Department of State, Homeland Security, but also some European governments, including the UK. I've done some work in Germany. I've done some work in Canada. So the inoculation work that I'm doing, it shows some promise, and I'll explain some of the promise here as I go through it here today. I'll show you the empirical evidence that is showing that this can be particularly useful for preventing violent extremism. I'm glad that I chose this topic rather than other kinds of topics that might have overlapped with some of the other speakers today. But before I get to what inoculation is kind of at large and get into it in conceptual terms, it's important first to think about where my ideas related to inoculation came from and why I decided to pursue this line of research, because it really frames how communication and violent extremism come together. Basically, several years ago, I noticed that we, and by we, I mean extremism researchers, specialists, security researchers, security specialists, practitioners in the US, we seem to have gotten better at trying to design interventions to prevent violent extremism and prevent radicalization to violence. We often come up with ideas, excuse me, and then we tend to pat ourselves on the back that we came up with such a clever idea to prevent radicalization, and myself included. I'm absolutely guilty of this. Unfortunately, a lot of these interventions, especially in the US, they don't have the evidence, they don't have the data to back the claims of efficacy that we make for them. Typically, the evidence that we have for these different types of interventions are based on case-by-case anecdotal data, which are useful. It's useful to have that qualitative evidence to back up what the programs are doing. But I was raised in the quantitative tradition to understand that to determine the effect of a given intervention or a given communicative phenomena, you need to show that there is a significant difference between intervention and non-intervention. So I developed a research agenda whereby I wanted to conduct quantitative research geared towards the development of what we called at the time P and CVE efforts, preventing violent extremism or countering violent extremism efforts. And the question that guided this work was whether or not communication science and communication theory can be helpful in developing a quantitative database or data set to offer empirical evidence for protecting individuals from radicalization to violence via persuasion by terrorist propaganda. And one way to think about this, or one avenue of approaching this, is something called attitudinal inoculation. And this is a counter-persuasion theory and a counter-persuasion practice that has been around for about 65 years now. So this is a tried and true approach to preventing persuasion, and as I'll show in a bit, preventing radicalization to violence. But to understand attitudinal inoculation, you first need to understand medical inoculation or biological vaccination, the way that it works, because attitudinal inoculation, the entire basis of the theory and the psychology behind attitudinal inoculation is based on a medical analog. So the gentleman who developed this theory originally, a gentleman named William McGuire, thought that ideas may operate the same way that viruses and bacteria do when we're exposed to them, and I'll explain that in a bit. But he considered how medical vaccination works first, and I'm sure we're all relatively familiar with it. But just as a refresher, the way that medical vaccination or inoculation works is that when an individual is exposed to a small amount of a virus or a bacteria via vaccination, and typically that small amount of virus or bacteria is weakened in some way. And sometimes it is a dead virus, sometimes it's just a weakened virus. But regardless, when the body is exposed to a virus, that virus replicates within the body. And as a function of that replication, the immune system is triggered and the body develops antibodies in response to it. So when the person is exposed to the virus in what I call the wild, or outside the lab, or just out in the real world, that virus is blocked from replicating because that person already has those antibodies. There's a lot of that in the news today with the proliferation of COVID and now Omicron and everything else. But that's generally the idea as to how inoculation works. Exposure to a weakened form of a virus motivates the body to develop antibodies against that virus. So when it's exposed to that virus beyond the vaccination, it's ready for it, it has the antibodies, and it can defend against it. So moving on to inoculation theory in the context of communication and social influence, as I said, the idea here is that people can respond the same way to ideas that they respond to viruses and bacteria, in that we can become resistant to both. In the same way that we can become resistant to viruses and bacteria that might make us sick physically, we can become resistant to ideas that might change our minds in a way that is unhealthy or unhelpful for us and for others. Now, the main thing to take away from inoculation theory, and if you take nothing else away from this talk, take away these two parts. These are the two parts of an effective inoculation message. And as I said, they are analogous to what happens when somebody is medically inoculated. First, the person needs, the person needs to feel vulnerable in a sense that their beliefs and attitudes are at risk of changing. Oftentimes when we have beliefs and attitudes, we like to think that we came up with them on our own, and that when those are at risk of changing, we generally don't like it. We don't like the idea that the beliefs and attitudes that we have can be at risk of changing because we come up with them on our own and nobody's going to change our minds. So by eliciting those feelings of vulnerability, of persuasive threat, and motivates the person to defend against any threats to their beliefs and attitudes in the same way the immune system is motivated to defend against ideas that might infiltrate the person's mind. The second part, after you elicit threat, is something called refutational preemption. And this is where you provide the individual with the tools they need to counter the persuasive effects of the messages they encounter later. This is essentially the antibodies themselves. You can do this in one of two ways, and I'll explain those in a little bit. But here, the idea is that you motivate the person to develop what I call psychological antibodies. These are basically the psychological analog to the blue things on my chart earlier. These are what the ideas run into when somebody is at risk of persuasion from either an extremist ideology or some other negative kind of belief or attitude. The research that I've performed, and I'll expand upon this in a little bit, show that there are two possible mechanisms of resistance to persuasion when they are exposed to an inoculation message. The first is something called psychological reactance, which I'll describe here in a bit. The second is a issue related to source credibility, meaning that when somebody is exposed to an inoculation message against a particular idea, they perceive that the person who exposes them to the idea later is less credible than they would if they weren't inoculated. And as I said, I'll expand on those too. Now, knowing you have discussed narrative theory already and have discussed narratives at a bit of length, it's important to know that within communication and within social science more generally, honestly, it's very rare that we see that theories and communication strategies are consistent, that they work often. One of the things that's unique about inoculation, attitudinal inoculation, is that it's been shown to be consistent across context in that it works. In the 60 years of attitudinal inoculation research, we found that with respect to health communication, political communication, more traditional political communication, interpersonal communication, more general areas related to persuasion and social influence, science communication, all these different contexts, we find that attitudinal inoculation has been an effective means of preventing people from being persuaded by ideas that we don't want them to adopt. So, with that said, excuse me, inoculation says that rather than persuade, even though it's often considered a theory of persuasion or social influence, the main idea here is that it helps targets to resist persuasion. It doesn't persuade people to do things. It helps them to resist persuasion from an idea that we don't want them to adopt. And as I mentioned before, there are multiple elements to it. The first being the elicitation of threat, and this is where you make the person think as though they are vulnerable to persuasion, not just by saying the message is effective, but because people like them have been affected by those messages in the past. That can be a particularly effective means of making somebody feel as though they're vulnerable to persuasion by telling them that individuals who are like them demographically, psychologically, and socially have been exposed to these messages in the past, and they too thought that they'd be able to resist the messages they were exposed to, but they succumbed to the persuasion by the message. That helps to elicit that feeling of threat. In the refutational preemption element, I mentioned there are two ways that you can do this, and this is where I'll explain those too. Ultimately, the point here is to provide people with the tools they need to challenge the messages they'll encounter. Now, the two ways to do this are called implicit and explicit refutational preemption. Using implicit refutational preemption, we give people the tools they need by exposing them to weakened forms of the argument that the extremist group or the persuader that we want to refute. We expose the person to weakened forms of the ideas that they are going to expose people to, in the same way that a vaccination, the shot, the booster you get, expose people to a weakened form of the virus, which will then replicate in the person's body. So in this sense, you implicitly give people the tools they need by exposing them to the ideas that they're going to encounter, but in a weakened form, and then challenge them with a strong refutation. That's called implicit refutational preemption. Explicit refutational preemption overtly tells the individual that, listen, there are these people out here who are going to try to persuade you. Here are the things that they are going to say. So you, instead of trying to just expose the person to the ideas without telling them that there are others who mean them harm or mean to persuade them, you tell them explicitly that you are going to be exposed to these messages. You tell them that there are individuals out there who mean them harm, and that will also motivate them to argue against the persuasive messages they'll encounter. So two different ways of going about it. It depends on the message target, and it depends on the messaging context as to which is more effective. But generally, it's been shown that both can be an effective means of preventing persuasion, not just with respect to violent extremism, but in other contexts as well. Now, I mentioned that there are two ways that inoculation triggers resistance to persuasion. And I mentioned source credibility, and that's relatively easy to understand. But there's this other psychological process or psychological phenomenon that I talked about called psychological reactance, or just reactance, often people call it. Now, this can be a difficult thing to understand. There are many different definitions for it. And basically, the best way to understand it is it's that negative feeling you get when you recognize that somebody is trying to persuade you. So if you've ever been in a store, or you've ever been on a car lot and you're just trying to window shop and maybe just look at a couple of things you're thinking about buying, and somebody comes up to you to try to sell you something, that strange negative feeling you get when somebody does that, where you just want them to go away, including car salesmen, then that is psychological reactance. It's based on the fact that when our autonomy is threatened, when we think somebody is trying to affect our freedom to make our own decisions, we go in the opposite direction of what they want us to do to reestablish the autonomy that we have. So typically, when somebody tries to persuade us, especially with respect to a topic, excuse me, with respect to a topic that we're unfamiliar with or is otherwise important, then we tend to go in the other direction to reestablish our autonomy. So the idea here, using a health communication example, somebody would have a healthy attitude with respect to smoking, that smoking is bad for their health, cigarettes cost a lot of money, and a lot of people don't find smoking terribly attractive, so they shouldn't smoke. The concept of psychological or attitudinal inoculation, independent of context, is to protect healthy attitudes like this. Now, I think about it in terms of violent extremism, which I'm going to get to here in a second. But it's important to remember that attitudinal inoculation is all about the protection of what we call, for lack of a better term, healthy attitudes. Okay? So, if we have a doctor who wants to prevent somebody from smoking who doesn't quite smoke yet, then an effective inoculation message might say that one day someone is going to come to you to try to smoke. It might even seem like it's a good idea to take up the habit. People may even tell you that it's not harmful. Although you don't smoke yet and you have no intention of smoking, people like you, young people who are in school, young people who watch a lot of TV, young people who are like you, socially, psychologically, and demographically, have been persuaded by others trying to get them to smoke. Try not to fall into that trap. The idea here being you're eliciting that threat. You're showing them that people like them have succumbed to the persuasive messages that they think they can otherwise resist. So, with all that said, what is the rationale for this with respect to extremism and radicalization to violence regarding attitudinal inoculation? So, in my research agenda, which I mentioned at the outset of my talk here, I mentioned that I wanted to use communication theory, specifically persuasion theory and social influence theory, to understand how we can prevent radicalization to violence and understand how people are drawn into extremist groups. So it's not just about, it's not for me just about developing counter messaging strategies using communication theory. It's about understanding these processes that we've tried to study for years in the context of communication theory. So the way that I look at radicalization and radicalization to violence more specifically, I look at it as, or I define it as, a social and psychological process by which an individual develops beliefs and attitudes consistent with a terrorist ideology. And when I say a terrorist ideology, I mean an ideology being a set of beliefs and attitudes that advocate a set of behaviors, violent behaviors, that underpin those beliefs and attitudes. Now, up until only probably the 2010s, give or take, radicalization was seen as an exclusively social and psychological phenomenon, and rightfully so. It does occur via social interaction and psychological processes. But it occurred to me that when people are exposed to certain messages, it can push these kinds of social and psychological processes to happen. And that has a name in communication theory called persuasion. So because belief and attitude change occurs via persuasive messaging, then radicalization and radicalization to violence more specifically can be a function of exposure to persuasive messaging. And if inoculation works in other persuasive domains, the question then becomes, why wouldn't it work for countering terrorist propaganda or preventing persuasion via terrorist propaganda? So that is why I chose inoculation as the first stop on my tour of different communication theories to consider, excuse me, how to prevent persuasion via terrorist propaganda and prevent radicalization to violence. So with all this said, in 2018, I performed an initial study to look at whether or not attitudinal inoculation can be an effective means of preventing persuasion by terrorist propaganda by collecting empirical quantitative data to this effect. Now, when I did this study, I think the N for the study was almost 400, if I'm remembering correctly. It was an opt-in survey type experiment with people exposed to some propaganda versus others. I exposed people to left and right-wing propaganda to see whether or not individuals were consistent in their resistance to persuasion across both ideologies. I tested whether or not the inoculation message was delivered via myself as the researcher, or as or the individual, an individual that is posed as a former member of the extremist group. Although both messages were written, so you couldn't really see the person, and they were both written by me. I was the ostensible source of the one inoculation message, and the extremist was the other. So we had a 2x2 experiment here with a pure control condition. And these were my predictions, that if we inoculated people against left or right-wing extremist propaganda, a couple of things would happen. Number one, that if we inoculated people, when they were exposed to the propaganda that we inoculated against, they would have a greater reactance response, meaning that negative pull-away feeling, that negative feeling that they want to reestablish their volitional freedom. So that was one. Number two, that reactance, that feeling, would be a combination of anger and counter-arguing. And I made this prediction because recent work in social influence has shown that anger and counter-arguing are both part and parcel of reactance. So essentially, I argued that when people were inoculated, they would feel more anger toward the extremist groups they were inoculated against, and they would counter-argue against their persuasive messages more than if they weren't inoculated. Third, that if we inoculated individuals, they will perceive the groups that develop the propaganda to be less credible than those who weren't inoculated. So that's that source credibility mechanism that I mentioned. Fourth, that, and this is the important one, that if we inoculate individuals, that after they were exposed to the extremist propaganda, that they would be less likely to support the source of that propaganda. meaning this is where the rubber meets the road, that we want individuals to avoid intending to engage in behaviors in support of the extremist group. And there were 4 different behaviors that made up this construct. There was ideological support, meaning things like writing posts or sharing posts on social media. There was financial support, providing money to the group for the purposes of their goals. Third was logistic support, so hiding their weapons or hiding their fighters when they needed to be hidden, or other kinds of supportive actions that fall short of actual violence. And finally, actual engagement in physical violence in support of the group. So getting in fights or picking up a weapon in support of the group. So this last prediction, or this 4th prediction rather, says that people will be less likely to intend to engage in those behaviors than if they weren't inoculated. And finally, this is an important one, that inoculation would increase reactance and decrease source credibility, and that is what will reduce intention to support the group. So in essence, that intention, the relationship between inoculation and intention, would be mediated by reactance and by source credibility. So with all that said, for those of you that aren't number inclined, I don't blame you. It can be a lot. So let me walk you through these initial findings here. First, with respect to counter-arguing and anger, remember that those are the 2 constituent elements of reactance. I found that when I inoculated people, they were significantly more likely to counter-argue against the extremist propaganda, whether it was left or right wing, whether it was presented as coming from myself or coming from the former extremist. People were more likely to counter-argue against that kind of propaganda than if they weren't inoculated, and that was a very significant test. Anger was almost significant, so close, but generally speaking, people did feel more anger when they were exposed to terrorist propaganda when they were inoculated relative to when they weren't inoculated. So these are the 2 constituent elements of reactance, but it doesn't speak to reactance as a whole. And I'll get to reactance as a whole, that aversive feeling about being persuaded. We'll get to that. With respect to the extremist group's credibility after somebody's inoculated, I found that when people were inoculated, they were significantly less likely to think that the group that produced that propaganda was credible. So this is what we wanted to. We wanted to inoculate people against the left and the right-wing propaganda in an effort to reduce the group's credibility. And that's what happened. When we inoculated people, they were less credible. The groups were less credible than than when people weren't inoculated. And finally, the important one here is support intention. And just like credibility, we found that when people were inoculated, they reported significantly less likely to support the group across those 4 behavioral domains I mentioned earlier than if they weren't inoculated. So everything taken here together is that almost everything, anger was annoying because it was so close to being significant, but it wasn't significant. Generally, everything was supported here. And I say generally everything because when we look at the relationships between these different variables, which is important to understand both the mediational process and to understand how reactance behaves with respect to inoculation. When we look at them all in conjunction, we do see that there is a mediation relationship here, that there was a direct relationship between inoculation and support intention, but that indirect relationship was almost negligible. It was almost 0, which means that the relationship between inoculation and intention to support the group is completely mediated by reactance, which, by the way, was a positive relationship. When you structure reactance as counter-arguing and anger, that relationship, that first prediction that I made, that is a true prediction, that inoculation increases reactance to the terrorist propaganda. But when you look at the structural integrity of the entire structural equation model, of the path model, we see that overall inoculation has a negative effect on support intention, because as inoculation increases reactance, the higher reactance gets, the less intention there is to support the group. That's and on the upper path, the positive sign leading inoculation to reactants. That shows that as inoculation occurs, reactants goes up, and the reactants with the negative sign, as reactants goes up, intention to support goes down. On the bottom path, we saw the exact opposite, which is exactly what we were hoping to see. We saw that as we inoculate people, credibility of the extremist group goes down, excuse me, and the lower somebody's credibility, or the higher that somebody's credibility is, or the higher the credibility of the extremist group, the greater their intention to support the group. So the fact that we were lowering the credibility of the extremist groups means that we were lowering intention to support the group. So what this shows us is that although inoculation acted kind of wonky with respect to anger, we had what we expected. There was a positive relationship with reactants, a negative relationship with credibility of the extremist group, and an overall negative relationship between intention to support the group when we consider that it was mediated. So the synopsis of this initial study was that, as I said, inoculation increases psychological reactants in response to extremist propaganda. That's what we want. It decreases perceptions of the extremist group's credibility. Also what we want. Because taken together, excuse me, they reduce intention to support the extremist group across those behaviors that I mentioned. This is due to the nature of the mediational relationships between inoculation and intention through reactants and through source credibility. And what's interesting, I mentioned this before, I talked about the different conditions that I included in the study. I tested this against left and right-wing extremist propaganda, and in case you were wondering which propaganda I used, I had to take out the names of the specific groups because the IRB didn't want me letting the individuals know which groups produced it, so they couldn't go find more propaganda on their own, which is understandable. But the propaganda that I used was a bit from, there's a group called the National Alliance, which is an American white nationalist group. They call themselves, they say they're about family values, but it's a racist white nationalist group for the right wing. And for the left wing propaganda, I chose an excerpt from a group that in many ways mimics much of what we call in the US the Antifa movement, or at least what individuals think the Antifa movement's ideology is. And this came from the Weather Underground's manifesto. So, their overall manifesto. So the Weather Underground was a group in the 1960s and 70s in the U.S. and elsewhere that was kind of anarchist and carried out quite a few bombings in the U.S. Regardless, whenever we found that inoculation worked across both kinds of propaganda, and we found that inoculation worked across both source of the inoculation message, whether it came from me or whether it was shown as coming from a former extremist that was part of the group that we were inoculating against. So in this initial study, which again I said was done in 2018, the results were exactly what we were looking for. This was almost like a proof of concept to show that inoculation can be an effective means of preventing radicalization to violence. So this was the first step. Now, I only recently began working at American University about 1.5 years ago now. When I conducted this study, I was basically a lowly fixed-term teaching instructor at Penn State, so I had very few resources at my disposal. So I had to do this study kind of funded on my own, and there was very little I could do beyond 2018 or 2019 due to my not having the resources to support further research. But now that I'm at American University, I'm doing research on this at a research lab called the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. The acronym is PERIL. So there we are undertaking more research to test inoculation in a couple of other domains. One being what we're calling, or what's called, race science. So one area of research that we're looking into inoculation and its effectiveness relates to the idea, the far right idea, that whites are inherently and biologically superior to non-whites. This is a theme that appears quite a bit in the far right online space across different groups and across different specific ideologies. We see this show up not just with respect to white nationalist or white power groups, but we also see it show up in places like incel forums and other places like that. mainly because what constitutes the far right in the US now is really a series of overlapping circles that makes a very confusing Venn diagram. But because this race science idea, because this is so pervasive in all of these circles, we wanted to test against it. And like with the initial study, we found that if we inoculate against the far right theme related to race science, that it prevents persuasion by propaganda consistent with race science. We tested this in a unique way, though, because we were very interested in understanding the way that inoculation works with respect to different kinds of extremist messaging. So we tested a video inoculation message against whether race science was presented as a meme. So these quick little bite-sized internet memes, well, we expose people to, which is one key way that these ideas are spread these days, and by more traditional video propaganda. And we found that across both, that inoculation worked to prevent persuasion via meme or via video. So just like past research in this domain, and just like my study in 2018, the inoculation seemed to work against race science type propaganda. Another area that we're looking into is called male supremacy. So this is basically the foundation of the ideology that underpins groups like the Proud Boys, who call themselves chauvinist in nature. A lot of the propaganda that we see here, very much like race science, it pegs males as being biologically superior to females. A lot of this propaganda, it advocates going back to, making America great again, and going back to a point where women were meant to be socially and sexually subservient to men. So a lot of this propaganda is very overtly sexist, and sometimes violently so. It often talks about the need to beat women to keep them in line, and all these other ideas. So we replicated our studies with respect to race science regarding male supremacy, and just as with the others, we found that inoculation works. It prevented persuasion by male supremacy propaganda, both via meme and via video propaganda. The male supremacy propaganda data was a bit messier, though, because we found one thing that affects how effective the inoculation treatment is for the kinds of propaganda people are exposed to with respect to male supremacy. It depends on how overt or how explicit the propaganda you're inoculating against is, meaning that if you spend any time online, you know that memes and different kinds of messaging, they can be either explicit or implicit in the arguments they're trying to put forth. They can be kind of little winks and nods, things we call dog whistles, or they can overtly say what it is they mean with respect to male supremacy. So that changes it a little bit, but generally we still see that inoculation tends to work across all conditions regarding male supremacy, though the data is still coming in. And I mentioned earlier the proliferation of memes and how they really define the way that the far right exists online. If you spend any time in any of what we call these alt text spaces, so like the Parler, Getter, Gab, increasingly these encrypted apps like Telegram and others, you find that what really passes as propaganda there is different than what it used to be. It used to be that people would develop videos and send them out, and people would be exposed to these arguments via what the group wanted people to know. But now it's mostly spread via these memes, because the internet has become a very cynical type place, and people have smaller attention spans. So these memes are really what make up the lion's share of the online propaganda we're seeing in these spaces, at least with respect to male supremacy and race science. But so we've been testing inoculation and its effectiveness of preventing persuasion via memes specifically. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, yes, inoculation seems to work against memes as well. Although right now we are testing the form of the inoculation message to see if certain forms are more effective than others. Specifically, we are trying to figure out if we can develop inoculation messages, traditional inoculation messages that have those two key elements, the elicitation of threat and the refutational preemption, whether implicit or explicit. If we can develop those into smaller, more bite-sized messages in the same way that extremist groups have transformed their propaganda into these bite-sized memes, we want to try to do the same to see if we can inoculate against these using smaller form type messaging. That research is ongoing right now. We have tested 90-second videos, 30-second videos. We're trying memes. We're trying all kinds of different things, with the idea being that we're trying to basically draw a line around the boundaries of inoculation and identify when it's effective, how it's effective, and who it's effective for. So with any communication phenomena, there are going to be moderating variables, and basically we're trying to identify what those moderating variables are, so we know how to employ inoculation in the right way and under the right circumstances. Now, I would be remiss if I at last didn't talk about a couple of other researchers who are doing work, excellent work, in my estimation, in the domain of inoculation and disinformation. Now, I've done a little bit of work related to disinformation, and I am of the mind that disinformation is going to be the biggest source of radicalization to violence in the coming years, given how pervasive it's become. In fact, I'm working on a U.S. Department of Homeland Security grant to understand how to use inoculation to prevent radicalization to violence by disinformation, far-right disinformation specifically. And I'll be collecting data on that in the coming months. But there are other researchers who have begun doing work in this space that I think needs to be looked into if you're interested in this kind of research. John Rosenbeek, Sander van den Linden, Josh Compton is another one. They've all done excellent work in attitudinal inoculation and its potential for preventing persuasion via disinformation. And I think that I'm actually working on a project right now with Josh Compton where we're trying to marry our two lines of research, whereby I know inoculation and extremism, they know inoculation and disinformation, and we're trying to understand how the two can come together, given that radicalization of violence is increasingly becoming a function of disinformation. They recognize that, I recognize that, and we're trying to kind of team up so we can pursue a research agenda that helps identify ways of fighting disinformation, especially with respect to how it advocates violence. So just a bit of a taste of what inoculation theory is, how I've used it, how I'm still using it, and trying to understand the way radicalization works and understanding how we can prevent radicalization to violence, and a couple of future areas of research that we're going into. And it's not limited to the last 4 slides. We are going in all kinds of different directions with this research. And luckily, so far, what we've seen is that inoculation is an effective means of preventing persuasion, at least to some degree, of radicalization to violence. So I will stop there, and I think I saw earlier from Isa that there's going to be a kind of an overall Q&A session. So I'll be more than happy to take any questions that anybody might have regarding inoculation or anything else that you saw during this presentation that you might be interested in. If you, I should say this too, because I should have my contact information on this slide, but if you're interested in getting in contact with me about inoculation or any questions, please feel free. My email address is just my last name, Braddock, BRADDOCK, @american.edu. And I'm sure you can find that email address somewhere, or hit me up on Twitter, whatever you want to do. So I will stop there. I will turn it back over to our gracious hosts and look forward to the next portion of the talk.
Thank you very much, Kurt, for your excellent insights and inspiring presentation. We certainly, thanks to you, learned a lot about inoculation and how it can basically disable effects of propaganda of any kind, and in particular, to violent extremism. This is certainly something that fits very well with the theme of this whole project that we are engaged with, because it works before people engage in the the violent extremism and can stop this process in place before it gets any further. So it's also something that can be really distributed in a positive way among young people. So yeah, we will definitely try to use this inoculation in our guides and in the intervention itself and in the videos that this project is trying to promote. That was really great. Thanks a lot to both presenters for your time and excellent insights that we can definitely use. And I will give the floor now to our project manager.
Well, thank you, Marcin, first of all, for organizing such an interesting webinar. Thank you also to the speakers. I think it's one of the last slides I would like to see. And to make some publicity really for our next webinar. There our host will be our Dutch partner, Untitled Chapter, and they will talk about utilizing the positive effects of social gaming. So social gaming as a means to connect to young people and to build connection. So it will be on, it's almost within a month. February 24th in the morning between 10 and 12. And this will be our 8th webinar, and maybe the next slide. There you can see we already have a whole list of webinars. They're all recorded. They're all to be found on our YouTube channel at the moment. So maybe, Marcin, if you could go for the next slide, just to make it quick. So it's on YouTube, ORPHEUS _project, and there you can find our webinars on the prevention pyramid, on radicalization from a more historical viewpoint, conspiracy theories in the far right, the extreme right on social media, safe spaces and online safe spaces, and of course, one last on Islamic reform movements and the difference between the different movements. And in a few weeks, in a few days, this webinar will be found there too. Okay. Next slide, maybe just to, so subscribe to our newsletter if you want to be updated on what's going on in the last year of our project, on our LinkedIn page, or email me directly. Okay, that's it. Hope to see you next time.